Deb Walton. It's so good to see you anyway, because I haven't seen you for a little while. And it's really good that you're a guest on David Anderson Talking Market Data, my new show. And I'm trying to be briefer, not ramble on like I normally do. So, Deb, one of the first things I ask all my guests to do is introduce you. You are a person who probably needs no introduction, but for the few people who don't know, who lived under a rock for the last God knows how many years, tell us about your illustrious career.
Well, hi, David. It's great to see you. I have spent pretty much my entire career of 30 plus years in financial services, in data and technology. I began my career working for a brokerage firm in Sydney. Ended up doing a joint venture with Dow Jones Telerate. There's a name that people that have been around for a while.
I worked there as well. I was 84 to 87. So but I was in London.
Right. So we did a joint venture at the time. Dow Jones were looking for a Bloomberg killer. Obviously, no one's really succeeded in that mission as yet. And along came our Australian company, GiltNet, with bond analytic product. Joint venture was done. I moved to the US to run that partnership for 2 years. Of course, I'm still here. So I say to everybody, keep your options open. From there,
No danger of you being deported or anything?
No, I'm safe. Although, who knows? If we go winding back on green cards, I don't know. But no, I'm safe. I moved from there to Cantor Fitzgerald, where I was a partner, and was very involved in Cantor's market data business, as well as a lot of new businesses that we set up with Cantor Fitzgerald: electricity brokerage, NOx and SOx, air emission trading allowance platforms, and ultimately developed eSpeed. From there, a little stint in private equity-backed startup, and then on to Thomson Financial, which became Thomson Reuters, which became Refinitiv, which became LSEG. And I stepped down from my full-time corporate role in 2021, and now into the portfolio phase of my career. Still in and around
the highlight of your career. Yeah, well, we're going to talk about that. So I think you and I, we agreed that we're going to split this into 3 hopefully quick chunks. Hopefully you'll come back for a second go at this, because I'm sure we're going to run out.
We'll see how the ratings go.
Well, exactly. I'm sure I will want you back anyway. So the first section, we're going to have a bit of a chat about, what is market data. We were talking about it briefly beforehand. How did it come to be? And then we're going to talk about the talent side of the equation. And then we're going to finish up with something that you and I are very focused on, which is that portfolio stage, that transition stage, that stage towards the end of one's career. But we'll come on to that. So kicking off, market data, what you were telling me a few things about how you've seen it. How have you seen in the years you've been doing it? Has it changed? And even looking back before you joined, it's evolved a lot.
For sure. Look, market data, information, let me speak in brochure speak. I must have written this line in many PowerPoint presentations, brochures, and dozens of speeches. But simply put, information is the lifeblood of financial markets. So at the risk of ancient history, think about when markets were first organized, financial markets were first formed. Let's think about stock exchanges in the early 1600s even. Coffee shops. People who wanted to trade in financial markets would go to a coffee shop, or they might go to a bar in, London, in New York, looking for, an opportunity to sit with someone, get that tiny little piece of information that they could use to form a view and use that to make a trading or investing decision. Think about what participants in the financial markets do today. Exactly the same thing. Participants in financial markets are looking to find that piece of information or insight that will help them make an informed trading or investing decision. The difference between hundreds of years ago and today is the technology that we have at our fingertips in order to be able to find that information. It's about the ability to access information from all kinds of sources, to aggregate it, to analyze historical trends. And then, of course, we moved into the ability to predict from that and then ultimately into prescribing. So to me, back to the statement I first made, information is the lifeblood of financial markets. It has always been, it will always be, but how we access that information and how we process it is going to continually be evolving challenge for those of us in the industry.
In all your years, in all my years, that has been this steady change as we've gone along. But there's inertia as well, isn't there? I remember sitting in Reuters when I was there. We had version 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of something. And obviously the 7th was much better technology than the first. But our customers were still on 1 or 2 because they had all these policies about controlling version control and whatever. So even though that technology tsunami, that wave of innovation takes place, people, organizations can be a bit slow on the uptake. Have you noticed that over the years? I mean, it's a sweeping statement, but it's like there's a lag, isn't there, behind the innovation?
But again, sort of resorting to brochure speak, I think there was something that in a brochure I wrote years ago that says technology will give an advantage to those who use it until everybody has that same technology. And then the advantage goes back to who finds the new point of innovation. So I think that's true, right? And so you'll always have early adopters, and then you'll always have those organizations that don't want to be on the bleeding edge. And then you'll have the followers. So in that span, that can take many years. And there's a lot of factors that come into that. It is obviously the economics of it. There's the sheer logistics of implementing technology. That's what makes our industry a challenge. And that's why it's not easy.
And I think an observation I would make of late is we've now got people in our industry with Oracle, AWS, Google, Microsoft are all involved in, and they were never really involved plus years ago. So it's created a whole new ecosystem of participants. And I'm sure that will change even more in the years to come. It's constantly changing. Shall we use that as a segue? I'm conscious of keeping these shorter, as we were chatting about earlier on. Going into the next topic, because I think there is a direct link between what we just talked about and talking about the human dimension, the personal dimension, jobs, roles. Talent is a phrase we've often used about in this field. And I think before we talked about this podcast, and you were suggesting topics that you feel passionate about, it was the fact that you observed that perhaps people working in this industry, although information jobs, data jobs, technology jobs are cool, a lot of the jobs in market data, I think wrongly, are seen as being a bit uncool. And I think you alluded to, a lot of them have slipped into pure procurement type situations, how do you see why or is market data jobs uncool? Or is that wrong? What? Discuss.
Yeah, no, I think you've hit the nail right on the head. And when we were at WIFIC in Austin, Texas last year, I had the privilege of chairing a talent panel, and we talked about this. I really posed this question, and it's actually a question when I was Chief Revenue Officer at LSEG that I would rather shamelessly challenge a lot of our clients around the way they were approaching engaging with providers in the industry, very much around this procurement type model, which I think is what it is, but it's causing us to, I think, miss a lot of opportunities. And let's just step back a little bit. If you look at the world now, there are very few companies in the world that aren't basing their business on some kind of data and analytics. To look at if they're online and they're using data and analytics to find customers, to promote offerings. It's hard to find an industry where data isn't performing an important part of either their logistics or their sales strategy. So when you think about it, the financial industry was probably one of the first sectors of commerce and industry that was using data so intensely, and all kinds of businesses set up around to serve that. And not surprisingly, data became, I think, the second largest cost for most organizations in terms of their expense lines. And if you look at recent history, let's go back to 2007. I guess that's not that recent, 18 years ago, when, the financial markets, went into another spin and cost cutting became a huge issue. Many of our clients, put a cost czar as a report into either the CEO or the COO, and market data became a huge target for cost cutting. I would argue that market data roles, even before then, were seen as a procurement function, but they became laser focused on cost being really the driving strategy.
But weren't we to some extent victims of our own success? That point you made about it being the second largest basically has grown into that. It's become such an enormous cost that generically a lot of firms, if they're trying to be more profitable, you can grow your way into success. Another way of being more profitable is to cut costs. And cutting costs, a lot of consultancies are out there giving advice to corporations on how to slash costs. And again, I remember seeing a TV program. At what point do you stop cutting off fat and start slicing into muscle?
Yeah, and also, I think you're right, but also in terms of stifling innovation. Just think about this. I would say that there are many, many, many financial institutions buying market data that do everything in their power to stop ideas from providers coming into their organization because they want to limit the demand for information. That is really counter innovation, if you think about it. The better way to be thinking about it is, if I'm in a market data role, how do I, find a way to be able to get more innovation, more data, and more analytics into my organization? And then how to find a way to have that be starting to drive the top line of the firm as opposed to it just being a cost.
And to be fair to our industry, and maybe we focused on procurement, there are obviously, because it's such an enormous part of customer firms, banks, buy-side institutions, what they buy, having procurement to professionally buy that is a good idea. And there are whole tranches of people really getting into the detail of how to do procurement in the right way. But there are lots of other market data roles. If we're talking about on the customer side of the equation, there are the business analysts, who I suppose are the people going out talking to the quote unquote business, the actual end users, and trying to understand what their needs are. And I suppose that innovation drives innovation. If the end users, a trader or a portfolio manager or somebody sitting in a role in a bank or a buy-side institution is innovating how they do trading, then they might want more different, newer, better data. And it's the job of the business analyst to then come back perhaps and work with the procurement person to buy it off. And you and I think, have worked predominantly on the sales side of the equation. There are equivalent roles in sales organizations. So there's lots of layers of roles.
Yeah, look, also, let me just make sure I'm not sending the wrong message here. I think I had the great privilege of having fabulous customer relationships with some people in market data that were really, really very thoughtful and were really pushing us in terms of innovation and looking to do exactly what I, have just sort of said, the industry should be aspiring to. The challenge comes from the top, where I think financial institutions, I can't begin to tell you how many times I would have a conversation at the COO level or the CEO level and say, share with me your top 3 strategic issues. Number 1 was cost. Now, if number 1 of a strategic issue is cost, then the people working in the organization are obviously going to be skewed to a certain set of priorities that's going to drive the success of the firm through that lens and in turn their own compensation. But I don't think we just put this problem at the feet or the hands of the clients or the buyers or the market data professionals. I think the way I looked at it at Refinitiv was, how do we do something as a provider to work with the industry to solve this challenge? And in fact, we did, without sort of shamelessly plugging any organization, but I will, because I still, have huge affection for my alma mater. We launched Refinitiv Access, which was a new commercial model designed to put us into that role of consultant that you talked about. Why would you pay a third-party consulting firm to come in and tell you where you can take cost out of your market data? An organization like Refinitiv or other organizations that we competed with certainly have the ability in looking across the customer base to see where those opportunities are. So take that concept. If what we were able to do in a lot of instances were develop trusted relationships with clients that were willing to partner with us, get inside their organization and understand where the cost reduction opportunities were, and transition that entire business model from this very procurement oriented relationship to one of real innovation. And to my knowledge, that commercial model is still serving Refinitiv quite well.
And I think,
again, I should say, a recommendation on the stock price or whatever that disclaimer would be, but I think that's the kind of partnership the industry needs.
and I think that partnership, you use the word trust, but it also is based on the fact that on both sides having a detailed understanding of each other, because that's something a hobby horse of mine, and slightly self-serving, is the knowledge and skills in the industry need to come up and up and up on all sides, both the vendor side, people selling stuff, but also on the consuming side of the equation. Because I think if we want to play in this grown-ups game, the game is an awful lot more complicated. When I started as a Teller 8 salesman, green screen, sorry to go back in history, it was a lot simpler. It really was a lot simpler. The financial markets were a lot simpler in the 80s. And I think things have got so much more complicated, complex, whatever the right word is. The skills and the knowledge of the people working in that need to be a lot higher. But it also, the rewarding side of that is intellectually much more stimulating. Whether it's financial, I think it is, as a career set, financially rewarding if you get into the right parts of it. It might not be as well paid as an equity trader at a big investment bank who are earning millions. You might not be at that level, but it's still, better than working, frankly, in other industries, working in pharmaceuticals or, I don't know, steel engineering or something like that. We are a well-paid sector.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, look, we are a well-paid sector. However, I think certainly one of the challenges for financial markets on a compensation level in, sort of the more off-trading floor roles, is competing with, the other new entrants, if you would want to call the Googles and the Amazons new entrants. But in terms of the financial markets, there is definitely a dynamic there, and there's a dynamic there about the cool factor. But this whole issue about competition for talent, I mean, every single company, I believe, is dealing with as the biggest existential issue that we have. COVID was a massive disruptor to the whole talent landscape, and organizations are still trying to work out, are we an in-office culture? Are we a fully remote culture? Are we a hybrid culture? And that's a huge factor these days in terms of competing for talent. Especially every person I know that is earlier in their career have a very explicit view of, I want to come to an office because I want that mentoring, to I don't want a job that's in an office. So that itself is a huge factor. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of AI and what that does in terms of talent. Talent is the biggest issue. The boards that I'm on, both for-profit and non-profit, not in financial industry, it is the biggest single strategic discussion that we have, talent.
And I think you touched on the generational, the spectrum of generations, all with slightly different perspectives. You talked about that. I get so confused with Gen Z, Gen this, Gen that, but whatever it is, the newer, there's people in their 20s, fresh out of university or whatever, again, have a very different attitude to work and life and what have you, and they have a certain requirement. And then the boomers, I'm 66, so I'm a different end of the spectrum. But again, something I'm very conscious of, I know a lot of firms are actually concerned about losing all the people of my age group, because there's an awful lot of people with skills, knowledge, that will, I was about to say die with them, not literally die with them, but leave with them. And the problem is there's a lot of infrastructure and technology. Not all of the infrastructure and technology is new and shiny. There's some solid established old technology churning away, business as usual. If the generation like mine, again, getting a bit dropping names, Triarch or RMDS or something, some of the technology that existed within there was known about by people who are now in their 50s and 60s, and they're leaving, they're retiring. And that's a problem. So there's problems at both sides. There's in getting new players in, and then people are leaving out the other end.
Yes, but see, David, at the risk of again being political, what you're really touching on is the importance of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And oftentimes we think about, or we have traditionally thought about diversity, we've thought about it in terms of initially gender. And that was a big issue for me 25 years ago in my career. Then we started to think about diversity in terms of people of colour. But more recently, we began to rightly think about diversity in terms of people that were bringing diverse experiences to the workplace. And that diverse experience is, people that have significant tenure and have experienced, sort of life cycles of business, which is a really important perspective. But you don't want all of those people that, have long tenure. You want to have that as a diverse mix with people that are bringing in new, fresh ideas that, emulate and are representative of the customer base. So, I think really passionate topic of mine, which is the absolute importance of a culture within an organization of diversity and inclusion, which is another really big factor in terms of attracting and retaining talent. And I really hope that with everything that's going on in politics today, that organizations that have made a commitment to diversity and inclusion don't go, off piste, but stay committed to the importance of diversity and inclusion as a really important factor that drives a really healthy and high performing company.
And I think it's we're straying into politics. There's a lot of politics in this, but I mean, the practical thing is, if you get diversity and inclusion right, it has it is something that helps a business to grow and to be profitable and to be better. So it's not just some quote unquote woke thing for the sake of it. It has practical implications. Yeah. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think some of the problem with it is complicated. I don't know who's in charge of it. Is it the CEO? I mean, I don't know where this is thought about or strategized.
It has to come from the top. And I had the great privilege working for Jim Smith when he became the CEO of Thomson Reuters. And in the first few months of his tenure, he formed a task force to tackle the issue of gender diversity. And I was very honoured and privileged to be asked by Jim to join that. And I had a conversation one-on-one with him and said, you've clearly got a lot to deal with right now. It was a point when Thomson Reuters was really challenged from just an overall business perspective. And here was Jim stepping in, but he wanted to focus on that. And his response to why was because this is something that is going to really take time for us to see the results, and it requires the CEO to lead it and to sponsor it. And so many organizations kind of push it over to HR, and it's fine, because in a lot of organizations, HR has evolved to one of the key functions in an organization, and it can be implemented. A lot of the programs can be implemented by HR, but really the commitment to it as a real part of the culture has to come from the top.
Is it fair to say you have to invest, you have to spend some money? It actually sucks in some money to begin with, but that will pay off. Again, a phrase I remember hearing, somebody asked the question, what's the difference between an investment and a cost? Investment sounds good and positive, but an investment's just a cost. I mean, they're both the same. They're both about spending money.
Yeah.
And as long as you spend money that has a good end. Although, again, I'm going off in different tangents here. I get a little bit hung up at the moment when people say, we've got to demonstrate ROI. Whatever we spend money on, we've got to link that with, a specific lead or a specific new business. And sometimes some of these softer things, marketing, training, diversity, you can't link directly to ROI, but logically it will generate ROI.
I could absolutely, totally agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. I think coming from the perspective of having to sell something, what I would always say to my peers, my team, whatever it was, is our goal is to really try to demonstrate to a customer that what they spend with us on market data or technology around market data is actually a driver of financial performance, which is exactly what you're saying, as opposed to an extraneous cost that you can take out. Now, that's why the whole issue of diversity and inclusion has to be led by the CEO. It has to be believed that this will drive the financial performance of the business.
Because
But look, again,
it's a long-term investment, isn't it? You're not going to get
right.
an immediate return.
And that was Jim Smith's point. But look, putting all of that aside, look, I believe that has to be the driver. It will be the driver that at the end of the day, businesses will hold on to. When times get tough, that will be the driver. So we have to do this. But it also, I think there is an element of it being the right thing to do as well. And one of the things that I often saw as a big turning point for CEOs, if we think about the issue of gender, which was kind of more in focus decades ago, I would notice when a CEO had a daughter and the daughter was starting to go to school, I can't tell you how many calls I got from CEOs that would say, or when they got into high school, I'd love to have my daughter have a conversation with you, because they were starting to take, an active role in envisioning the future for their daughter. So now all of a sudden, and I say he, it could be male or female, but typically a male that may not have thought about the importance of diversity, looking through the lens of his daughter, all of a sudden wanted to see an environment in the future where females could have access to the same opportunity that perhaps their son might have. And that became a big belief turning point for many male CEOs.
I mean, there are so many things we could talk about. In terms of telling what we've just talked about, and this whole talent, diversity, and inclusion, and what are the, if you are talking to the industry out there, what are practical bits of advice? It could be a 3-hour seminar on that, but if we're just doing 5 minutes or so of some key bullet points of actual practical steps that people working in the industry now, in big companies or small companies, and I think there is a difference between what you do in a big company compared to a small company.
Yeah.
Advice.
So advice is, first of all, what a strange thing to say. Let's start with the data. Understand where your organization is through the lens of diversity, if that's what we're talking about here, relative to the industry. Understand where you're having challenges in particular parts of the industry or at particular points of tenure in retaining talent. So as many people have said, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. So start with the data. I think then it is create a goal. If this is where we are, where do we want to be? So you've got a now and you've got a goal, and then really looking at a playbook that consists of how do we attract the very best talent? And that gets into how are we showing up as a hiring organization? Where are we hiring talent? Is our compensation at the right level? So all of those things that go into how do we attract talent? How do we develop talent? Look at AI, right? I mean, organizations, if you just think about that one thing, are having to invest in developing their talent to be able to operate in an environment that's very difficult. And then the third is really how do we then retain talent? So look at those 3 pillars and put together a really simple, executable plan, and then make sure that it is being measured, that it is actually tied into the bonus and the performance and the performance-based bonuses of key executives. And it's that simple, really.
And I think there's another dimension which runs across all of those, which is how do we communicate? How do we promote our industry and roles in our industry outside of that? And I don't know if this is possible. We often talk about this. I mean, a classic thing I've heard in the FISD world is let's go to all the universities and explain how wonderful market data is. there's two problems with that. There's hundreds of universities. Who's going to all these universities? Maybe individual companies do recruitment fairs at different universities. And also, I don't know. I mean, question I'd ask you, and I think I know my answer on this, is I don't think you can persuade somebody in their second year at university to want a career in market data. I think you might persuade them to go into finance or technology, something broader. Is
Yeah.
it realistic to persuade undergraduates or even high school students to want a career in market data?
Yeah, look, I think that's the question that we really struggle with. I think a lot of jobs are, around role models, right? Financial markets, obviously, I think is a target for a lot of people. So I think attracting people, as you say, into financial institutions. But then once inside the financial institution, how do the financial institution, I think, themselves position the roles of technology, data, analytics, as a cool role? One thing probably is not having market data sitting in procurement or sitting in the finance function, putting it into the technology part of the organization. Look, I think it is really all about role models. If you think about getting young
Yeah.
girls, into technology, that's been a whole big push, in many places on an actual government level of making STEM, attractive to girls. And that has really been all around role models. I remember a really funny little story that somebody said to me once. It was a young boy broke his arm, went to the ER. The nurse was female. He had to have surgery. The anesthesiologist that came in was a female, and the surgeon was a female, physical therapist was a female. And after the whole experience, the little boy said to his mother, "Mom, can boys be doctors too?" And I
Which,
love that story because
yeah.
it's a great example of one of the things that I think a lot of people, particularly if you look at people of color as well, and that have achieved success, or females that have achieved success, inevitably, somewhere in part of their story, they said they looked up in an organization and saw no one like them. So they didn't think there was any hope. And that's when a lot of people deselect, by the way, particularly women. Or the successful ones often looked up and saw someone that looked like them, and that gave them hope, and it gave them, an aspiration to strive for those roles. So however the role models are created, I think within financial institutions, we, need to take the steps to make those roles something that is aspirational for people to want to pursue.
We're going to come back to that. So I mean, that's something I know in the FISD world and the wider. By the way, when I keep mentioning FISD, this is David Anderson's voice talking here, not FISD, but I'm still very closely involved with FISD, and those two mesh together quite nicely. So as I knew, Debra, on that topic, we could keep talking, but we can't. We must stop ourselves. So we'll quickly go on to the next topic. And the next topic is something I think close to both yours and mine's hearts, which is this transitioning. We talked already a little bit about those people at the latter end of their careers, what they do, and some of them leave. Some people just retire and stop, literally stop, and go and fish or travel or cookery classes or whatever. And then other people, and I think you and I are doing this. I describe what I'm doing as semi-retirement, because part of me is slowing down, but only a part of me. And as we were talking before we went on air, I'm struggling with it. I'm still not quite sure what I want to do, what I should do. I've also got to consider appointing my wife, who's this podcast is my hobby. I don't play golf, so this is my hobby, but it's costing, because I keep buying expensive equipment and paying for Riverside subscriptions. And so my wife is not very happy with me. But hey, what's new? What's new? But how are you dealing with the transition?
Well, I think the interesting thing for those of us that do have a life partner, I think that is one of the big issues of not going to the office every day. I think COVID kind of eased us into that, because all of a sudden my husband Mark did have to suffer me being around 24/7, where prior to that, prior to COVID, I was probably away from home
But you're
200
such a
days a year.
shrinking violet. You just quietly got.
Well, no, actually, the difference is I am a total extrovert. He's a total introvert. So the big challenge for us now, still 3 years into me leaving my full-time sort of distraction, as he would call it, is that now I plan way too many things for us to do by his measure. And I think secretly there's a little part of him that would like me to be a little bit more distracted away from planning his life.
All right. Yeah, that I can see that. But again, we were chatting earlier on. I put three different elements to it. There's more than three elements. I think there's a financial element. I'm kicking myself. I should have. I think I was 12 years at Reuters, and I didn't join the pension scheme for the first 5 years. Anyway, I was stupid, but it's too late now. So I'm not badly off, but I'm not as somebody who's got 25 years at Reuters, Thomson Reuters, whatever. Frankly, are doing very nicely. The final salary schemes are few and far. So having financial security is one thing. One of the reasons I'm doing this is keeping my brain going, staying involved. I love the industry. I love all these things. So intellectual stimulation. And then the third element, which I also consider this to be, is a social dimension. Rightly or wrong, I love having a chat with people. Maybe I love chatting a bit too much, as some people tell me, but I enjoy this social interaction at work. I mean, my wife tells me I have too much of my social life linked with work and not enough in our little village or something. But that's, hey.
Yeah, but look, I think all of those things are true. And I think that the transition I really want to think of a better word than, I really don't like the word retirement because it has so many negative connotations to it from, history when people.
From our parents and grandparents.
Yeah, when
how
they retired and they sat on the porch and then died 2 years later or something like that. I think from my perspective, it is all the things that you said. You need to have a plan for retirement and you need to be able to afford to do, what you want to do when you retire. And that's different things to different people. I think the big challenge for a lot of people, especially people that have had very visible careers, is the concern about their identity. Because for so many of us, our identity is very associated with what we did. And what our job was. And for me now, I was concierge key on American Airlines. Now I think I'm pushing it to have gold status and kind of stand there at the airport watching all these concierge key people get on the plane somewhat wistfully and realizing that I'm basically a nobody. I think that's a big issue for a lot of people. I thought it would be a huge issue for me and much less of an issue than I thought. I'm fortunate to live between Connecticut and Florida. The community that I live in Florida, I've made some great friends here. I play a lot of golf, play a lot of pickleball, so have met heaps of people. And I was out last night with a couple of people and we were talking about this topic. And, one of the things that I said was, one of the things I love about living here is most of the people here have been successful in their careers. Nobody asks anybody what they did. They just assume they wouldn't be living here if they didn't have a level of success. What's important and how people judge other people now is based on the most important things in life, which is basically how they show up as human beings, their humanity, their giving back to the community, their integrity, and they tend to judge people more on values. So on that sort of identity issue, I've come to terms with the fact that what I did or what my reputation was doesn't really matter anymore. What matters is how I show up as a human.
And picking up on the identity, I'm doing this podcast to maintain my identity a bit. So that's part of it.
It's also to maintain your connection. The reason, listen, I still have so many friends from, one of the great things about working for an organization like Thomson Reuters is anywhere in the world that I want to go, there's somebody that I can connect with that I know. And I love to do that. And whenever I go up to New York, I still see people. I still talk to people. I still get messages from people asking for career advice. And that connection is really important because I think we did work in an industry, and people that are listening to this podcast that are still in the industry, we value the industry that we work in. And my advice to everybody is to continue to maintain those connections. It's an important part of our life and who we are.
And just to finish off on, because we're now towards the end, what advice would you give? There's two groups of people, either people in the same situation as us, in that semi-retirement transition, whatever you want to call it. That's one group. And then there's a group a bit earlier, the people who maybe it's another 10 years, 5 years or something. It's looming. I don't think my daughter who's 27 cares about this at all or even thinks about it. But maybe the group in their 40s, maybe late 40s, whatever. And what are the bits of advice?
Yeah, so the first piece of advice that I give our kids is your financial plan. Number one.
Yeah.
Max out
Save.
your 401k, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The next piece of advice that I've always given everybody is build your network of connections and be authentic and true to that. Because, when you step into your next phase of your life, which I'm now in, those connections are really gold. Those connections are what open up the opportunities for you. So I think for people that are still working full time and haven't yet got to that point of transition, financial plan, connections, and reputation. They are the three most important pieces of advice. And then there's a whole conversation about how you make the transition, because it's probably one of the most significant points of change in anyone's life. You talk about the big changes in your life, when you get married, when you have children and your life really changes. When you stop working full time, that is a huge change. And it took me a couple of years to work out what I wanted to do, and I'm still working through that, but I feel like I'm in a good place now.
I think my advice, and I suspect you might mirror this, is it isn't binary. It isn't you're working full time and then you're retired. There is an opportunity to do a phased period. I'm doing 50%, maybe more than 50% because I'm doing it, but I'm doing it in stages.
Yeah.
The other thing I didn't mention, you have to be conscious of health. One of the things, it's a bit morbid, but there's a point in your retirement, semi-retirement, whatever you want to call it, where you're active and you can do stuff. And let's be blunt, let's be honest with ourselves. At some point in the later years, you're less able to do that.
Right.
Horrible health thing. So anyway, seize the moment, seize the day, be deliberate. That would be my advice on it. Look, Deb, it's been a pleasure. I knew it would be because we've had a lot of chats over the years and I've always enjoyed them. I knew we'd run out of time. We could have talked for an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours. You've got to get to Pilates and that you keep fit. That's another thing.
I do indeed.
So, look, thank you for doing this. I don't know when I'll next see you. I'm in New York on April the 8th. Of course, when people watch this, they might be watching it in 2 years' time. So all these dates won't make any sense, but they make sense to you and I. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure, and best wishes.